Representative, I have spent 12 exhausting years serving as a human protector for several commanders-in-chief. I recognize precisely what a lethal risk to this republic looks like, and it is my obligation to inform you that the threat originates from right here inside the chamber. Intelligence Chief Dan Bongino sat resolutely at the testimony desk within the sterile, high-pressure environment of the House Intelligence Committee hearing room, his frame projecting a false ease while his gaze stayed incredibly piercing and alert. These were the experienced eyes of a veteran Secret Service operative who had mastered the mental skill of identifying faint threat indicators long before they ever became obvious to the public. He maintained the robust, conditioned physique of an individual who consistently attended the gym at 5 o'clock every morning, no matter the situation. His speech possessed the raspy, undeniable weight of a veteran New York patrolman, and he gripped a manila file that appeared heavy enough to effectively end several prominent political lives in one sitting. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar leaned toward her mic, that very recognizable and patronizing grin slowly forming across her features as she readied her first strike. It was the specific, rehearsed look she displayed whenever she intended to preach to someone she had already labeled as intellectually or ethically inferior to her. As the most outspoken and stubborn member of the political collective known as the Squad, she had spent nearly a decade refining the dramatic skill of the public, virtuous critique. On this particular afternoon, she arrogantly assumed the result would be identical to her previous triumphs over less equipped witnesses. Mr. Bongino, she started with a look of disgust, elongating the sounds of his name as if the mere flavor of it were distasteful to her sophisticated palate. Allow me to ensure I completely comprehend your alleged credentials for this high-ranking national security role, she remarked, her speech saturated with feigned politeness. You are a web broadcaster, a prominent Fox News media figure, and a man who has dedicated years to spreading unfounded theories to millions of naive listeners for individual profit. She rearranged her documents with a scornful, dramatic wave, making no effort to mask the intense loathing she felt for the man positioned before her. What exactly were you? A glorified escort who waited outside shut doors while the genuine intelligence experts performed the arduous practical labor? You merely verified identification cards and wore a synthetic headset, and now we are expected to trust that you are fit to command the entire American espionage community. She glanced around the chamber at her leftist associates, silently beckoning them to participate in her open display of noble contempt. AOC provided a lingering supportive nod from the side, while Rashida Tlaib grinned with a sense of collective superiority. With all possible respect, Director, and I must clarify that I employ that formal title very loosely today. I have served on this board since long before you even understood what a secure facility entailed. I have been personally informed on secret missions that you have only viewed in top-secret files that you likely lacked the brainpower to comprehend. Perhaps today, we ought to be the individuals posing the tough inquiries while you remain there and pay attention for once. The Democrats in the chamber laughed together, and several assistants even clapped gently in a display of ideological agreement. This was the aggressive version of Ilhan Omar they all recognized and respected, the intrepid leftist fighter who had challenged presidents and never once backed away from a partisan clash. Bongino did not cringe or adjust his position. If anything, a very faint, perceptive grin appeared on his face as he observed the performance. It was the tranquil, enduring smile of a predator who had been wishing for precisely this sort of conceited introduction from his adversary. "Are you quite finished with your oration?" he inquired in a tone that was threateningly soft and restrained. Omar's gaze narrowed at once as she sensed the transition in the room's atmosphere. "Pardon me," she barked back, her speech lifting in a defensive stance. I asked if you were finally finished with the dramatic act, he insisted, leaning forward just enough to dominate the area. Because if you have concluded your foreseeable strike on my career history, I actually have some very particular inquiries regarding your own. He slowly unfastened the heavy, overfilled file sitting before him, and something sparked in Omar's eyes, the initial small sign that this session might not proceed as she had planned. "Representative," Bongino remarked while steadily drumming on the file, "you are truly not going to enjoy what is stored in these records." Omar's grin faltered for a tiny fraction of a moment, a second of real doubt that was usually concealed from the public view. She tried to regain her composure quickly, but she was not rapid enough to avoid the high-definition sensors. The C-SPAN equipment had recorded the micro-expression. Millions of online observers had viewed it instantly, and the predator had just turned into the target without even sensing the snare was closed. Bongino turned over the first page of his file with the steady, frightening poise of a sleuth who had performed this 1,000 times. He had carried out this practice in questioning rooms, in legal chambers, and in life-or-death moments where miscalculating the facts meant a person perished. "Before we plunge into the shameful specifics of these papers," he remarked, his heavy New York tone starting to sharpen his words, "let me inform you of something vital about my individual past, something that you will not discover on my formal government bio." He stared straight into Omar's eyes, refusing to permit her to look away as he cited the date of September 11th, 2001. "I was a member of the NYPD during that time. I was there on site. I observed those massive structures collapse, and I inhaled that poisonous atmosphere. The air was dense with the grit of crushed cement, mangled metal, and the remains of thousands of blameless human beings." His speech fell to a deep, raspy tone as he mentioned losing close comrades and brothers on that ghastly dawn. "These were individuals I had grabbed drinks with only the previous week. Guys with small children, devoted spouses, and whole existences that they were never going to experience. 3,000 blameless Americans were slaughtered by cowardly assassins who detested every single principle this nation represents." He stopped for several long moments, allowing the massive burden of the disaster to rest over the abruptly silent hearing chamber. "So you can imagine my total amazement, Representative, when I discovered what you had to say regarding that dimmest day in our history." He extracted a sharp printed copy from his file, highlighting the date of March 23, 2019, at a CARE dinner. "You were the honored primary speaker at that gathering, and you stated something that I find truly impossible to forget." He read straight from the sheet, citing her comment about a group being established because some people did something. He placed the copy down on the desk with a heavy bang, his gaze never departing from hers as he echoed the phrase. "Some people did something." That is how you decided to characterize the single worst terror strike in the history of the United States. "Some people did something," he echoed, and the echoing seemed to make the statement sound even more empty and insulting. Omar's carefully built poise finally started to fracture slightly, and she moved forward with a speech that was now pointed and defensive. "That particular remark was taken entirely out of its intended framework by my partisan rivals," she claimed. "I was actually discussing the broad bias that Muslims encountered after the strikes and the deprivation of civil freedoms." "Oh, so it was out of framework," Bongino noted as he raised a different paper from his broad collection. "Let me recite the entire full framework of your oration then, and perhaps that will assist in clarifying matters for everyone present." He started to recite the entire segment slowly and carefully, allowing every single word to strike like a mallet blow in the quiet chamber. When he finally concluded the recitation, the room was so silent you could hear the buzz of the climate control. It actually sounds notably worse when you listen to it in its complete framework, Bongino remarked with a freezing, firm look. You weren't merely attempting to downplay the dread of the strike. You were purposefully making the disaster all about yourself. You asserted that Muslims were the genuine victims of 9/11, not the 3,000 deceased Americans or their shattered households. You disregarded the emergency workers who are still passing away from lung cancers from that day to concentrate on your own partisan story. Omar's speech lifted to nearly a yell, labeling his line of inquiry Islamophobic and blaming him of utilizing a disaster for advantage. You are employing a national catastrophe to achieve cheap partisan points against a Muslim woman who has labored for her neighbors. I am employing a disaster. Bongino's speech sliced through her complaint like a honed metal blade through parchment. I personally dragged shattered corpses out of that burning debris, Representative. I transported portions of people that I couldn't even recognize to their households. And you had the nerve to stand before recorders and characterize that slaughter like a routine parking citation that slightly bothered your group. He moved forward even more, his street patrolman reflexes entirely taking over the professional facade of the session. Here is the absolute reality regarding 9/11. It wasn't merely something, it was mass homicide on a scale we had never witnessed. It was an undeniable act of conflict committed by 19 assassins who steered commercial jets into structures to slaughter as many Americans as possible. Every single one of those mass killers would have been absolutely delighted to hear a United States representative characterize their labor so lightly. Omar tried to block him again, asserting he was distorting her statements to fit a preset story of hatred. I am not distorting anything. I am literally reciting your own statements back to you from the formal transcript, Bongino replied. These are your phrases and your ideas. If they sound negative to the public, that is your mistake, not mine. He placed the record down, remarking that 3,000 Americans were dead, and she couldn't even be bothered to label the event what it was. A faint noise of astonishment moved through the visitors, and someone in the rear muttered a prayer of doubt. A Republican official on the board was clearly fighting to keep a neutral look as Bongino reached for a second file. But we aren't truly here to discuss your language today. Let's examine the more functional topic of how you actually arrived here. I mean literally how you entered this nation, because I have quite a few inquiries regarding that procedure as well. Omar's gaze expanded significantly, and for the very first time, something that appeared like real terror sparked across her features. He unfastened the second file with the systematic, cold accuracy of a sleuth presenting a solid case for a panel. Now, I'm merely a former patrolman, he remarked, his speech taking on a falsely relaxed and social tone for the chamber. I'm not a fancy, expensive travel lawyer or a tenured academic. I'm just a man who spent 20 years learning to detect falsehoods. He extracted a large pile of records, telling her that many aspects of her individual past simply did not make sense. Omar straightened her frame in her seat, her look tightening back into a shell of aggressive and stubborn resistance. These are nothing more than bigoted falsehoods and unfounded theories that have been refuted 1,000 times by the press. I will not honor these foul individual strikes with any type of a reply, she declared resolutely. I haven't even stated anything of weight yet, Bongino observed as he raised a hand to quiet her protest. I am simply grasping records, public files, and government documents that any inhabitant in this nation can find for themselves. Let me just navigate through these observations, and you can feel free to inform me exactly where the files are mistaken. He scattered the sheets across the testimony desk, mentioning a 2009 union to a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. My individual existence is not the concern of this board or this session, she tried to complain. It is a topic of public legal documentation, so yes or no, did you wed Ahmed Elmi in the year 2009? After a very lengthy and painful delay, where she looked at her legal team, she finally muttered a yes. Bongino extracted yet another record, declaring that this was where the account became particularly fascinating for the sleuths. Academic records from the 1990s show an Ahmed Elmi residing at the exact same location as your own household. This person possessed the same surname as your father's primary name and matched the same age category as your brother. Omar's speech lifted sharply again, labeling the proof an unfounded theory and a bigoted falsehood spread by the far right. I am simply asking you regarding the formal records. Bongino's speech stayed tranquil and firm despite her yelling. These are confirmed academic records. Are you asserting they are fraudulent, or that someone created them 30 years ago? The claims regarding my brother are bigoted falsehoods spread by individuals who wish to see me stumble, she shouted. I didn't actually assert he was your sibling, Bongino observed as he tilted his head in a mock-inquisitive way. I simply declared that the files show someone with that name at your household's location, and you are the one who mentioned the relative. Omar went still in her place, her mouth slightly ajar, but no noise emerged as she sensed her own error. A sharp breath moved through the visitors, and someone actually chuckled aloud. A pointed noise that was quickly suppressed by the leader. Here is what I recognize for a certainty, Bongino added, looking down at the sequence he had built. In 2017, you formally separated from Ahmed Elmi, but you had been residing with another man, your current spouse, since at least 2011. You submitted taxes collectively with both of these men in the same years, specifically in 2014 and 2015. He raised the tax records for the censors, remarking he wasn't a bookkeeper, but knew you couldn't submit with two spouses at once. One of those unions had to be a total sham for travel goals, or the tax submissions are a felony, he implied. Omar erupted in a burst of fury, rising to her feet and pointing her finger toward the testimony desk. How dare you strike my household and my individual past in this public setting, she yelled. This is exactly what they do to black Muslim women in this nation, whenever we dare to speak reality to power. She turned to the leader, her speech cracking with a blend of fury and hopelessness, as she asked the inquiry to end. Mr. Chairman, I insist that this line of intimidation be halted immediately, as it is based in bigotry and Islamophobia. The leader moved awkwardly in his seat, but remarked that Bongino was simply asking regarding public records. You are free to reply to the proof or refuse to answer, but the witness may proceed, he decided. Omar's speech fractured as she turned back to Bongino, drops of pure rage shining in her eyes. You are a bigot, you are a white elitist, and you are everything that is fundamentally flawed with this country. Bongino waited with limitless composure until she had concluded her rant. Then he spoke in a speech that was almost soft. Are you finally finished? He asked, as Omar sat back down, inhaling deeply and fighting for any sense of restraint. Here is what I have gathered from 20 years in criminal justice, he remarked quietly to the quiet chamber. When you pose a basic inquiry, and the person replies with blame and individual strikes, it means they can't reply. I asked regarding academic records and tax submissions, and you labeled me a bigot because that is a handy distraction. The state of Minnesota analyzed these very claims, and they didn't say you were blameless. They said they couldn't confirm it. They observed that many of the pertinent records had been hidden or ruined before they could be properly checked. You paid notable penalties for election fund breaches that were found during the process of that specific check. He moved forward, remarking that when someone pays a penalty, They aren't proving their blamelessness to the world. They are usually purchasing quiet, and I wish to know exactly what you were trying to purchase with that cash." Omar opened her mouth to speak, shut it, and then opened it again, but she was entirely without words. AOC moved over and started muttering something desperately in her ear, trying to assist her in refocusing. Talib was staring fixedly at her device as if she wished to vanish into the glass and depart the chamber. Bongino reached for another file, admitting that travel and union laws can be complex legal gray zones. So let's discuss something much more basic: the flow of election cash that was intended to select progressives. He grinned, but it was not a cordial look. It was the expression of a lawyer who had discovered the direct proof. Let's discuss where your contributors' cash actually traveled, specifically the $2.8 million paid to one agency. Bongino unfastened the third file with the massive pride of a man who had kept his best proof for last. In the Secret Service, we possessed a very famous motto that you should always track the cash. People misrepresent, and records can be faked, but cash always speaks the truth regarding a person's real goals. He extracted a thick pile of financial files, declaring that he had tracked her cash and found a very fascinating account. Omar had recovered a tiny bit of her poise, but her speech was extremely cautious and protected. "My election finances are entirely open and have been checked by the appropriate authorities," she asserted. Bongino cited the name Tim Meenat, an election advisor who managed an agency called the E Street Group. "Your campaign paid his agency over $2.8 million over several election periods, which is a giant sum. That is a lot of cash for advice, especially from a candidate who constantly yells against the power of cash in governance." Omar found her speech again, claiming that her campaign engaged a valid agency to provide required expert labor. "There is nothing odd about a campaign engaging an advisory collective to manage communication and tactics," she remarked. Bongino disregarded the excuse and asked straight when she started sleeping with the individual in question. The statements hung in the atmosphere like a live bomb, and the entire chamber seemed to pause its collective breath. Omar's features twisted with a level of fury that appeared physically agonizing as she yelled about his nerve. "It is a perfectly valid inquiry, given the millions of dollars involved," Bongino remarked while raising a paper. "This is a separation file from 2019, where Tim Meenat's spouse at the time specifically identified you as the cause. She declared under oath that her spouse told her he was abandoning his household for you." He placed the record down, remarking the payments to the agency started long before the union concluded. "So you were directing millions of dollars to a man you were personally involved with using the cash of your contributors. These were small-amount contributors who trusted they were helping a moral leftist goal, not your individual life." Omar tried to shift the talk, asking how much Bongino was paid by Fox News to spread falsehoods. "I made cash in the private market by creating a firm and taking chances," Bongino shrugged carelessly. "I will gladly reveal any financial record you wish to view if you will consent to do the same. Will you reveal the full agreements between your campaign and the E Street Group so we can see the labor? Will you show the American public exactly what was provided for nearly $3 million of election gifts? Will you clarify why the payments grew so notably around the same time your individual bond became tighter?" Quiet filled the chamber again, and Bongino raised another paper from the Federal Election Commission. Here is what the FEC observed: multiple breaches, improper payments, and a total absence of required files. Your campaign was forced to pay penalties once more, and he placed the sheet down with a final snap. "You recognize what this looks like to someone who has dedicated 2 decades to checking financial crimes?" he asked. "It looks like you employed your election funds as an individual bank account to maintain your way of life. It looks like you paid your partner millions of dollars while he was still wed to someone else. It looks like the leftist leader of the poor was managing a financially doubtful task from the inside. Omar's speech was shaking with a blend of fury and terror that was becoming impossible to conceal. "This is nothing but a smear effort planned by my partisan rivals to destroy me," she asserted. "This is your own FEC folder," Bongino replied, as he raised the thick pile of sheets for everyone. "These are your campaign's own reveals that you provided under the risk of perjury, not my statements. If these records are a smear, then you are the one who smeared your own name," he remarked. He gathered the sheets together, remarking she had spent years preaching to the public regarding greed and special groups. "And the whole time, you were doing exactly what you blamed everyone else of doing in this town." He shook his head, remarking that in his old area they had a very specific term for that: hypocrisy. "But that isn't even the worst portion of this folder. The worst portion is what you stated regarding your fellow inhabitants. Let's discuss your views on dedication and love of country, because that is the most telling part of all." Bongino placed the last and largest file on the desk with the seriousness of a magistrate giving a life term. When he looked up at Omar, the legal intensity in his eyes had changed into something deeply individual. "On February 10, 2019, you put out a message that I think most Americans will never discard," he started. Omar stated nothing as her features went white, sensing which portion of her past was arriving next. Bongino extracted a printed image of the post, where she replied to a reporter regarding Israel. "It's all about the Benjamins, baby. You wrote to millions of individuals on the web," he recited. "For anyone who doesn't recognize, Benjamins is slang for $100 notes, pointing to a tainted financial power. You were asserting that American officials only support our partners because they are being paid by Jewish cash." Omar found her speech, though it was much lighter now, and she cited her previous regret for the message. "I regretted that and stated it was a teaching second for me," she breathed. "You only expressed regret because you were identified, and the reaction was endangering your job." Bongino cut her off. "You expressed regret because your own party heads were forced to blame you for using anti-Jewish cliches. Nancy Pelosi labeled it a deeply painful remark, and your regret was nothing more than planned damage control." He extracted another paper, remarking it wasn't merely a single post, but a habit of conduct. "A month later, you implied that American Jews possess a dual dedication to an external nation. That is one of the oldest and most lethal anti-Jewish insults in the history of the world," he observed. He scattered multiple copies across the desk, showing a past of her doubting the dedication of Jewish Americans. "You have dedicated years to asking if they are truly dedicated to this nation or if they put another land first. You have blamed your own fellow inhabitants of being tainted by external powers and putting cash above their morals." He stopped, looking straight at her as the weight of the hypocrisy hung in the atmosphere. "And the whole time, you are the one with giant unsolved inquiries regarding your own travel and union. You are the one who paid your partner millions in election cash while he was still wed. You are the one who downplayed the worst terror strike in our past as merely some people doing something. You are the one who has been penalized repeatedly for major financial and election breaches by the state." He moved forward, declaring that she had a lot of courage to judge the dedication of anyone else. Omar tried to gather her mood, asserting she had always been a speech for the silent and the burdened. "Let me tell you an account regarding a small girl." Bongino's speech fell into an almost private, narrative tone. "In 1992, there was a youngster residing in a dusty escape camp in Kenya after fleeing a civil conflict. Her household had avoided warlords and expiration, and she had absolutely nothing to her identity. No residence, no protection, and no prospect until a specific land said yes to her household. That land was America, the very country you dedicate so much of your time blaming and attacking. This country opened its entries, moved that household across the sea, and provided them protection and chance. They provided that small girl a shot at a life she could never have envisioned in Somalia. His speech toughened as he remarked that girl developed into a United States representative. That is a path from escapee to lawmaker that can only occur in this specific land. This is the America you label bigoted, Islamophobic, and fundamentally ruined to its very center, he cautioned her. He rose slowly, asking what she had done with that incredible present she was provided. You stood before censors and labeled 9/11 a small event where some people did something. You blamed your neighbors of dual dedication while your own past stays wrapped in doubt and falsehoods. You took millions from contributors and paid it to your partner while he was still wed. You employed every single benefit this land offered and then dedicated your career to telling everyone how awful it is. He signaled at the file of posts, remarking her remarks regarding everyone being purchased and tainted. You assert that those who disagree with you cannot be relied upon and are moved only by greed. He leaned over the desk, his speech falling to a whisper that somehow reached every corner. But here is my genuine inquiry for you. When exactly did you start trusting the rules don't affect you? When did America move from being your rescue to being your primary partisan target? He inquired. When did the land that pulled you out of a camp become the land you blame for everything? He stood tall, declaring that from his view, she was the only one with a dedication issue. The quiet that followed his statements was total and choking for everyone present in the chamber. Ilhan Omar sat motionless, her mouth slightly ajar and her eyes wide with a look of total amazement. She tried to speak, but her lips moved without making any heard noise for the transcript. Then, the members of the squad started to quietly depart the hearing chamber one by one. It began with Ayanna Presley, who had been Omar's nearest partner since the very first day. Now, Presley was picking up her sheets with careful thought and avoiding any eye contact with her comrade. She stood up, walked to the side entry, and slid out without stating a single word to anyone. Omar's gaze followed her, a look of pure doubt blending with a sense of deep individual abandonment. Then, Cori Bush, the agitator who never retreated from a clash, suddenly became interested in her device. She messaged something rapidly, stood up, and walked out through the main entries without a look. She didn't acknowledge Omar's presence as she left her comrade to face the witness by herself. AOC actually tried to step in, her speech shaky as she moved for a short break to refocus. The leader immediately decided her move was out of order, declaring this was a witness session, not a business gathering. AOC sat back down, beaten, and she looked at Omar with an expression that had moved to sympathy. This wasn't a partisan fight they could win. It was a total slaughter they needed to flee. She shaped something silent to Omar before picking up her own items and moving for the exit. Rashida Tlaib was the last to depart, standing suddenly with the features twisted by a shell of rage. "This is a shame, and nothing more than McCarthyism," she yelled as she readied to depart the chamber. The leader cautioned her she was out of order, but she asserted she didn't care regarding his rules. She labeled it a partisan murder and ran toward the exit, hitting the door behind her. Ilhan Omar sat entirely by herself at the long board desk, surrounded by the vacant seats of her comrades. The woman who had insisted on dedication from everyone else had just discovered what her own was worth. The total break of her poise arrived slowly at first, then all at once before the censors. Her hand, which had been signaling at Bongino with such rage, started to shake uncontrollably. She tried to drop it to the desk, but seemed to have lost all command of her own frame. You can't," she tried to declare, but her speech fractured and the statements faded away. Drops were flowing down her features now, not the planned drops of an official, but real ones. These were the warm, furious drops of an individual who had lost total command of the story. They sliced visible paths through her paint as they fell onto the costly sheets before her. She reached for her liquid cup, but her hand was shaking so severely that she struck it over. The liquid moved across the desk, wetting her notes and falling onto her lap in a mess. She didn't even seem to see the liquid, as her inhaling became uneven and gasping into the censor. The microphone recorded every breath as her torso lifted in a desperate fight to find oxygen. "I am an escapee. I arrived here with nothing. You don't get to do this," she gasped out. She couldn't conclude the idea, and her mouth kept moving while only wet, gasping noises came out. The C-SPAN sensor tightened, recording every shake and every desperate look for assistance that never arrived. Her partners were gone, the Democrats were motionless, and the leader was observing the moment in quiet. Nobody was going to rescue her from the results of her own past on this specific afternoon. The provoker who had preached to America regarding its errors was now ruined by her own statements. Bongino picked up his files slowly, showing no signs of bragging or individual victory over her. He simply gathered his records with the speed of a man who had concluded an arduous task. "I have no additional inquiries for the representative," he stated to the leader with a nod. "I think she has already replied to everything that the American public required to hear today," he declared. He stopped at the entry to add that her failure to reply told the public everything they needed to recognize. He walked out of the chamber as the censors kept moving on the still shape of Ilhan Omar. She sat alone at the desk with liquid falling onto the deck and drops still flowing. Surrounded by vacant seats and the wreckage of her career, the image would mark her forever. 40 million Americans observed the event occur in real time, and the effect was felt at once across the land. What occurred wasn't just a partisan loss, it was a planned breaking down of a carefully built look. For years, she had placed herself as an untouchable figure who was above any type of blame. Any inquiry was termed as bigotry or Islamophobia, to turn away all check of her actual behavior. It worked for a long period until someone decided to simply disregard the labels and pose the inquiries. Dan Bongino didn't call her labels or strike her belief. He just recited the formal records. He signaled the mismatches and let the heavy quiet speak for itself in the hearing chamber. The days that followed were pure mess for her workplace as they fought to build a reply. Her formal declaration blamed Bongino of a bigoted hunt intended to quiet a woman of color. It cited Islamophobia 11 times, but failed to address the actual claims regarding her union or cash. The declaration was teased online because she was still calling individuals labels instead of replying to the facts. The squad tried to hold a press briefing the next dawn, but it was a total mess. AOC stood at the stand looking clearly uneasy, while giving a declaration regarding the use of sessions as weapons. They took no inquiries and stood with looks that ranged from stubborn to deeply unsure. Significantly, Ilhan Omar was not present, and her workplace asserted she was simply busy for remark. Journalists who watched her residence stated no one had entered or departed for 2 full days. The tag regarding her reveal was popular for 72 straight hours, a record for a partisan theme. The clip of the last inquiry regarding her dedication was viewed over 100 million times globally. It was changed into 14 different tongues and played on repeat by news agencies everywhere. 1 week later, a journalist found Bongino at a tribute event for fallen patrolmen. He was asked if he felt he had traveled too far or been too harsh to a serving member of Congress. Bongino pondered the inquiry and shook his head slowly, declaring he had only revealed her own statements. If asking an official to clarify their public remarks is too far, then we have lost duty. The journalist pushed him on the individual nature of the inquiries regarding her union and cash. She paid millions of contributor dollars to someone she was involved with. That isn't individual, it's public. He remarked that for years she employed her identity as a cover to avoid any type of duty. The press and her associates were too frightened of being called bigots to actually perform their tasks. I'm not frightened of being called labels after 12 years of protecting presidents and working the paths. A faint grin moved across his features as he noted she had every chance to reply to the inquiries. She could have clarified the tax submissions or the agreements, but she chose to strike instead. That conduct tells you everything you need to recognize regarding the reality of the case, he remarked. When someone can't reply to basic inquiries regarding their behavior, it's because the replies are much worse. He chuckled off the claims of being a white elitist, noting his years protecting Barack Obama. He mourned that such statements had been turned into a prank and lost their real intent. The real disaster is that when genuine bigotry occurs, individuals won't trust it because of this overuse. He adjusted his coat and declared that Omar had made a decision regarding the kind of official she would be. She could have employed her account to move individuals, but she employed it as a blade to separate. She employed her history to turn away from her own mistakes and strike the land that rescued her. He turned to move away, remarking that you should be able to support the claims you pose. She blamed everyone else of taintedness while doing the same, and now she has to encounter that reality. On TV screens across the land, the clip of her total break played repeatedly. The shaking hands, the vacant seats, and the inquiry that possessed no reply became the account. In her residence in Minneapolis, she sat in the gloom with an unsure future and a silent device. The claim she had dedicated her career to throwing at others had finally been turned back on her. She had dedicated her existence to doubting the dedication of others, and now she possessed no reply for her own.